This is Peter Helen with Dave Wemhoff on Citizens for Community Media. And we're going to talk about the conflict in Ukraine, and I think a scripture that might be fitting is in Jeremiah 23:13. In the prophets of Samaria I saw a disgusting thing. They prophesied by Baal and led my people Israel astray. But in the prophets of Jerusalem I have seen a more shocking thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one turns from wickedness. All of them have become like Sodom to me, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. And looking at Ukraine, you just see, you just picture a mess. You picture the leaders living super corrupt, the religious leaders. You don't know how how are they putting up with this? So how can we look into this situation and make sense of it?
Well, first of all, war is hell. William Tecumseh Sherman said that. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman was a Union general in the American Civil War, and he burned a path about 40 miles wide down to the sea, what we were taught. And he said war is hell, and I think he was a bit optimistic about that because war is actually very, very bad. It's probably worse than hell. And so, the people who are going through a lot of suffering in Ukraine, we have got to have our hearts go out to them. And there are a lot of good agencies that are out there actually doing things to help people that are involved in a war that really isn't even their fault. Unfortunately, I think they're caught in the middle of something that is bigger than them. But you've done homework actually on the religious situation over there. Then you've found out that and you'll have to tell us about it, because you found out that there's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's split off from the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church has its basis in Kiev.
The Russian Orthodox is in Moscow.
But it's in Moscow now, but it started in Kiev like 1,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, they're connected. So actually I don't know the real history on that. What I do know is the history of religious influence in wars, which
right.
Oftentimes historians don't go there. Or by the time they go there, it's too late. But usually religious feelings can play a huge role in a war. Okay.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
The War of 1776, especially a guy named Clark out of Nebraska, who's a British historian, he argued that the key of it, the core of the American Revolution, was that these Calvinists had fallen off into Arianism, and eventually they were Judaizers. They were Arians and Judaizers, and that conflict with Orthodoxy. Once you're an Arian, you're saying that Jesus is not God. So that weakens your respect for authority. Okay, so the American revolutionaries blew off King George because they were being fueled by a religious belief that the Lutherans had predicted that Calvinists would do that.
So religion can be used to advance interests that are actually inimical or harmful to the very people the religion's supposed to be there to support. In other words, what I'm saying is that throughout history, religion has been used to fuel conflicts, to get people on board with a conflict. Now, maybe that conflict is not necessarily for religious purposes, because there's always somebody behind it, I think. When you had the Protestant Reformation, which I think was a revolution, which really was very catastrophic to Europe and to history, because it broke up Christendom. When you had that revolution, you had very powerful nobles supporting the Lutherans, supporting that division, because these rich, powerful nobles don't want power from a church to check what they do.
But it's like, how did Trump get into office? Partly because people didn't like Hillary Clinton. How did Biden get in? Partly because people didn't like Trump. What was going on with Luther was, at that time, the church had gotten corrupt. And these guys were kind of reacting to corruption, and then you do whatever.
Or do they overreact? They overreact.
Well, yeah, but they were overreacting to something. So if the church has corruption, or any entity politically has corruption, people are going to react.
So if religious bonds are broken between people, then you break up unity within the society and between societies.
The classic is America was hardly Catholic at all at the time of the American Civil War. America was mainly Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian, besides the Anglican. Okay, and there was only one Methodist church 20 years before the Civil War, one Baptist church, one Presbyterian church. Over the issue of slavery, they split. So you had Northern Methodists, Southern Methodists. They split over whether slavery was a sin or not. The Methodists were the first group in the history of the church, John Wesley, history of the church, that actually called the relationship a sin.
But there was also an economic basis behind slavery. I mean, you know, as difficult as may be for some people to understand or accept now, you know, back then, slaves were valued as property.
The Bible calls your slave your money, okay? And then the South had a lot of their money, so to speak, in the slave.
And so religion gets broken apart. And in America, since we never had a state church, and in America, since we never had the Catholic Church really that strong, you had all these religious sects break apart.
You had the three denominations, and you had the three statesmen. The three greatest statesmen that America ever produced, in a lot of people's minds, was John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. About 1850 they died, but they all said toward the end of their lives, because that's when the churches split. The Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians divided over slavery. The three statesmen said they don't see how the union can hold. Because if there's not something spiritually holding you together, it's not going to hold. The Russians know that. They have a state church. You've got to have you got to be tapping in. Remember Edmund Burke said the human being is irretrievably religious. That's just who we are. Okay, you can go atheist for a short time, but you're not going to last. We are radically religious. And the smart people that like to manipulate can manipulate your religious beliefs, create division, and then play you.
I think that what we see with liberalism, and we talked about this the last time, and I mean, this is twice on your show in a month. I mean, you must be running out of people to talk to, or you really like talking to me, I don't know, but you know, what we see with liberalism is we see this individualization of everything. And I think, as we talked last time, liberalism leads to totalitarianism. And I think we're seeing that. And just in our society, we saw it concerning a certain health condition and the treatment for that health condition, you know, in recent history. And we saw the same people who questioned the mainstream media about that and the government about that within a very short period, I mean, probably almost minutes in some cases, they start to support what the mainstream media narrative is in connection with what's going on in the Ukraine. And even the whole thing of saying Ukraine or the Ukraine is subject to some discussion, because the Ukraine is meant to refer to a region. Ukraine is supposed to mean the country. So there's a narrative, and the language is very carefully controlled. And so, you know, what you said about the, you know, different leadership and so on may not fit into that narrative. And that narrative is very, very tightly controlled by the mainstream media, who walks in lockstep. And recently, Archbishop Vigano said something which I thought was pretty powerful. It just came out 2 days ago. Today's March the 8th. A friend of mine just gave it to me right before this. Let's see. Yes. It must be recognized that national and international health institutions, governments, magistrates, law enforcement agencies, and the Catholic hierarchy itself all share responsibility for the disaster which is going on in the Ukraine, each in its own sphere, by actively supporting or failing to oppose the narrative. And he's saying that a disaster that has affected billions of people in their health, their property, and the exercise of their individual rights, and even their very lives. Even in this case, it's difficult to imagine that those who have been guilty of such crimes in support of a pandemic that was intended and maliciously amplified could suddenly have a jolt of dignity and show solicitude for their citizens and their homeland when a war threatens their security and their economy. And we'll talk about economy later, but then at the bottom he says, he goes through what the official narrative is, that President Zelensky is the national hero, he's a defender, that Putin is a warmonger, a thief, a killer, all this.
The Ukrainian church calls him an antichrist.
The Ukrainian church does?
Yeah, I read that.
Oh, okay. And then he says, this is the official narrative to which everyone conforms. Being at war, this is important really, because being at war, dissent immediately becomes desertion, and those who dissent are guilty of treason and deserving of more or less serious sanctions, starting with public execration and ostracism, well experienced with COVID against those who are unvaxxed. But the truth, if you want to know it, allows us to see things differently and to judge the facts for what they are and not for how they are presented to us. This is a true and proper unveiling, he says. And then in this paper, he goes on and he talks about a number of things: the expansion of NATO, interests arising from the blockade of Russian gas supplies, the Pentagon's virological laboratories in the Ukraine, which I just read are now being considered Chinese disinformation, an indirect threat to China's expansionist ambitions, which we can talk about. I think there's a Chinese component to what's going on here. The Biden's conflict of interest in Ukraine, the Ukrainian nuclear question, the color revolution in Ukraine, the independence of Crimea and the Donbass, and then President Zelensky, and Zelensky's relations with the IMF and the World Economic Forum. And then he talks about neo-Nazi and extremist movements in the Ukraine and the Ukrainian war in the plans of the New World Order, and that Ukraine is the victim here. And he goes on and on with even more. It's a very long...
10,000 words, I thought it said.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very long article. But it's kind of surprising to see an analysis that I don't think weighs in on any one side or the other, but it clearly gives you a third view of looking at what is going on.
And he's a cardinal. He's not a lightweight figure, right?
Well, he's an archbishop. And,
he is.
But he was the papal nuncio to the United States. So that's a huge job. I mean, you're like the Pope's personal representative. It's like an ambassador, personal representative to the United States.
Right. So we would tend to listen more to him than if he was the nuncio to the representative for Russia, let's say.
Well, I don't think you get these jobs being papal nuncio unless you know something about the country you're going into, and you have relations with the people there, so you can actually talk about what is happening. So I think a lot of what he's talking about, as we mentioned before we came on here, dealing with the media and the narrative is once again intermerifica. We're dealing with the question of intermerifica, and a lot of people don't trust the media now. But now they seem to be expressing support for the narrative that the media is putting out, that Cardinal Vigano is talking about, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is, they're not going to stick their heads up if they don't have to. The second thing is, hey, the other thing is over with, so we can get on with our lives. And then a lot of people understand too that I think that they're part of something, which is really kind of on the winning edge of history. The West and NATO keeps advancing. The West and the United States keep advancing, and they don't seem, to be running into any opposition. And a lot of this is just beyond their realm. And what a lot of people do, they say, this is international relationships. It's up to my government, which in many cases is really a reasonable thing. You would expect more analysis, from the church leaders. That's why he says, I blame the church leaders for allowing this narrative to go forward.
But one thing he didn't say, this was in the, I was looking, following this a little bit, and this is all about Vigano in his letter, but Catholic Reporter, are you familiar with National Catholic Reporter?
National Catholic Reporter, right.
In there, though, they quote the Russian Orthodox Patriarch, Kirill. You've heard of him? Okay. He's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and an ally of Putin. I read somewhere that he encouraged Putin to invade. Of course, we don't know if any of this is true.
We don't know. We're getting this all through.
Right. So I always like to say
sources.
I read this.
Right.
And the source could have been good, or who knows.
So it's kind of like reading Vatican II documents. You can decide which version you want to believe. Okay, anyways.
Well, people are having a hard time figuring out if they're a boy or a girl, let alone this stuff, okay? What they got, 40% of the younger people identify with something no one's ever heard of before. But Kirill repeated a long-held contention that the West wants to enforce the practice of holding gay pride parades as a test of loyalty to its values. This was in his Sunday sermon. Okay.
This past Sunday?
Yeah, in a sermon on Sunday, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and an ally of Putin, repeated in that sermon a long-held contention that the West wants to enforce the practice of holding gay pride parades as a test of loyalty to its values, which include the acceptance of homosexuality. The Ukraine war, he said Sunday, resulted from the eastern region's refusal to acquiesce.
Acquiesce to Ukraine.
To acquiesce to sodomy. I mean, acquiesce to accepting homosexual behavior.
By the way, the United Nations reported, and they're an independent agency, they reported, I believe, in the Donbass that there have been around, their numbers don't add up, but it's around 38,000 casualties over the course of about 7-8 years. So.
Right, 14,000 dead.
14,000, about 24,000 wounded.
Probably seriously wounded. He in his sermon, this is what he actually said, if humanity accepts that sin is not a violation of God's law, if humanity accepts that sin is a variation of human behavior, then human civilization will end there, Kirill said on the pre-Lenten celebration known as Forgiveness Sunday. Then it says, but Pagano sees a deeper plot to institute a new world order. But they go together, though. I think that bishop, or the head bishop there, of the mosque, the Patriarch, I identify with what he's saying. Okay, I think that's super important that the church keeps out accepting sodomy in the culture, which we have failed. Okay, we have taken it in. That's a sign of total weakness. It's a degeneracy, and Putin says it all the time.
Well, if you had a state-established church, then you would be able, and it was the Catholic Church, which is required by Catholic doctrine. If you have that, those things wouldn't happen. So what you're talking about is how some people view Putin, and other people view him as a tyrant. Some people view him as a big savior of the West, and other morals and traditionalists, and other people view him as a murderous tyrant. And you can kind of watch the talking points. I saw Steve Mosher the other night on EWTN, and he made sure to say that Putin is a murderous liar, tyrant.
So he burned his incest.
Right, and Weigel said the same thing. And I don't know. I don't know, what he's done. I read something about some apartment fire or firefight where he killed a number of people. I'm sure he's not lily white. But what you're seeing is an amazing similarity in remarks in the media, even by the talking heads. And Glenn Greenwald commented on that on February 28th. He commented on that in his article. And he's also been watching the rhetoric in the media and watching the rhetoric in government circles. And it keeps increasing and increasing. And along with that, and he's talking about rhetoric in the West. And so along with that is this narrative that, Putin's a bad guy. Maybe he is, but he's a bad guy, and he's losing his mind, he's crazy. Well, I don't know, would you want to raise the rhetoric, with a crazy guy who's got nuclear weapons at his disposal? That has caused a lot of people a lot of concern, whether there could be a nuclear war. I think the chances of a nuclear war have increased. I think that what a lot of concerns are is there could be an accident, and then you fire off the nuclear missiles. And then what you have is a lot of dead people. And that having been said, while that is a big Earth event, nuclear wars are survivable. And if you look at the models, a lot of people die, a lot of the infrastructure is gone, but you do have a reduction of the population, and you have global cooling. So I suppose you could say that's one way to get to the Great Reset, but that is a real concern people should have, and I think that they should be concerned, because I think this is a very serious thing happening in this part of the world. So that's kind of the two narratives that you're talking about that are happening here. You know, some people view Putin as a great guy trying to keep Christian tradition, and of course the Western American media is saying, well, you know, he's running into Ukraine and he's destroying freedom, and you know the price of freedom is higher gas.
But Americans are not reliable sources to determine what a tyrant is, because if you preached against sodomy, some Americans would call you a tyrant.
Yeah, that's right.
So you know, I guess everybody's definition of tyrant is all personal. You know, well, it's whatever you personally think is a tyrant, and then you go, okay, what's your personal definition of tyrant? And they won't be able to tell you.
Well, that tracks with the whole idea of you know, of liberalism, which is a focus on the individual, which is a focus which ultimately leads and feeds modernism, which is this idea of vital eminence, that we determine our own God, our own religion, so we can determine
every word,
whatever words mean.
Right, so nothing makes any sense except that word, you get to decide its definition, and you get to decide every definition of every word you speak. Well then, how does society hold together when everybody has different definitions for every word?
It flies apart, and it becomes more easily controllable by the people with the most resources and the means. People I've called the plutocrats. And I think you've had the plutocrats controlling American society for a long time. I think Kevin Phillips' book, Wealth and Democracy, is a great read. And he's not alone in that regard. So I think you have, in the West, you have a global plutocracy called globalism that's extending its reach around the world. And it does that, you know, through different events. And in a way, I'm kind of watching what's going on in Ukraine and seeing a replay of what we've seen before. I mean, that was Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler. They're comparing Putin to Hitler. You know, so we're seeing this replay, and it always ends with, you know, the dictator dying or being killed or whatever.
Well, first of all,
and their country being conquered.
America's already accepted the idea that a dictator, whatever that is bad.
Yep.
Now, is there any logic to be able to make that claim? No, there is no logic. In other words, if you're the boss of a company and you dictate to your subordinates, do this, they don't complain about that, do they? They expect you to do that.
What you're talking about on the state level, when you're talking about the country or the state, you're talking about an authoritarian ruler. You're talking about a guy who's got the power, okay? Or a guy or a group that has the power. In Russia, it's undisputed that Putin has the power. He threw out the oligarchs in the early 2000s.
But he almost had to.
Well, they were
running the country.
The country.
And the government should run the country.
Right. I mean, even the plutocrats wanted Yeltsin gone. So, you know, that's who Putin took over from. And Matt Taibbi does a real good article on this. And he talks about how the plutocrats actually supported getting Putin in power, you know, patted him on the head and helped him and said, hey, he's a great guy, doing well. And then now on February 26th, the chief of the Council of Foreign Relations says we need regime change in Russia. Okay, so what you're talking about is power being in the government. Okay, and my book, John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, American Proposition, talks about that as being a real enemy of the American plutocracy. That's a real, just like a strong church is an enemy of the plutocracy, because that controls what the powerful private interests do. And so that's why, you know, Putin has the real power. Last Friday or Saturday, Anatoly Zevin is with the Quincy Institute. He's written books. The Quincy Institute, oddly enough, was founded by the Koch brothers and by George Soros. But the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statesmanship, you know, puts on talks and stuff like that. Zevin wrote an article for MSN in the Washington Post. He says, I don't think the oligarchs are going to overturn overturn this guy. I don't think they don't have the power, they don't have the intention, they don't really care to.
And I don't think the Russian oligarchs want to necessarily.
I don't think the oligarchs want to do it, from what Zivan is saying. So what you have nowadays is you have this entire, Putin is very powerful in the state. That checks the powers of the plutocrats or the oligarchs, and they don't like that. They don't want that. Another person, that is pretty troubling here is Xi Jinping. But this goes way back because
he just came out and said something today.
Yeah, there is an aspect of this that's not being fully looked at, and I've done a little bit of homework on it, but it's developing, as it goes.
This is where it needs to go, because I was asking a friend on Vigano, what's their objective? What do they really want? Where are they aiming at? He said, well, I don't know if he's saying that. He doesn't, come on. What's their overall objective? And I think you've looked into that a little bit more.
Well, I think that the overall objective of the global plutocracy is to subdue Russia and to subdue China. I think that's where they're going. And, foreign policy is long-term. It's continued from administration to administration. We're seeing that right now with, the China sanctions and the trade issues that Trump started, and Biden has continued, okay? And Biden's talking about build America's economic nationalism. That's what Trump talked about. So this is long-range stuff which stays there from administration to administration, and I talk about that in my book. And so back in 1995, LA Times reported that U.S. military and intelligence officials are beginning to cast a wary eye at China as a possible long-term rival, a future threat to American interests in Asia and Pacific. The venom of communism has been replaced by extreme Chinese nationalism. Assistant Secretary of Defense Joseph Nye, who became a Harvard professor, said that all China has to do is basically just assert its dominance in its area, and it will make itself an enemy of the West. Over time, this became a reality. And so what you had is Samuel Huntington wrote a book, A Clash of Civilizations. It came out in the mid-90s. It was briefed, to the high-level officers. It talked about two threats, coming up. One was Islam, and the other one was China. It says, Huntington argues that the most anti-Western civilizations are the Confucian, led by China, and the Islamic. And this was Huntington in the middle of the 1990s. So this was starting to
What do you
get
say,
on
the most
people's-
anti-civilization?
Anti-Western civilization.
Anti-Western.
So the Western civilization right now is liberalism.
Yeah, well, like Bishop, the Patriarch of Russia basically said it's basically the promotion of sodomy, from his perspective. How a culture could actually hold on to that sin and think they're going to survive. He said they're nuts. You're not going to survive holding on to that. History shows that. You can't destroy your family, and then think you're going to prosper.
Well, I think a lot of people agree with that. And I think the Catholic Church, at some form, I don't know, the leadership now, I don't think believes it, but I think the doctrine holds to that. The doctrine holds that idea. That destroys your people, ultimately. And it sends people to hell if you engage in that and you're part of that. Because society is supposed to be there for virtue, and for mankind to achieve his final end, which is to reunite with God. And certain things are just simply immoral.
Yeah. How could you have a family altar in your home, and have your prayer times and your Bible readings with your family as a father, and not argue that it's about virtue? What else is it about?
I think that's what Catholic doctrine says. So what happened over the years, the National Security Strategy gets published by the United States. And if you make the national security strategy as a bad guy, you're in the big time. So in 2015, it seemed to change as to Russia. It said escalating challenges to cybersecurity, aggression by China. That was after the Maidan Revolution. The accelerating impacts of climate change, the outbreak of infectious disease, give rise to anxieties about global security. And then in 2017, under Trump, we have Russia was viewed as a problem to security. So in 2017, under Trump, the national security strategy says we got revisionist countries of China and Russia. Those are the enemies. So China and Russia challenge American power, influence, and interests. attempting to erode American security and prosperity. They are determined to make economies less free and less fair. There's that economic reason. They are determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries, control information and data, repress their societies, and expand their influence. The economic aspect was repeated, most recently, February 25th, by Larry Summers, talking to David Weston on Bloomberg TV, and he said, we have to follow Abraham Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, for the people, not just at home, but abroad, because the profitability of our businesses depend on it. And he was talking specifically about the Ukraine situation. So this is their mindset.
How does he understand of the people, by the people, for the people? Why is he using that phrase? What's he trying to accomplish?
Well, I think by now people understand that when you talk democracy, okay, it may float most everybody's boat, but there are going to be certain people who have more resources and more abilities than others, and they're going to lead the show. They're going to control it. It's like we talked about, I think, the last time. You get 1 foot past, your defender in a football game, you can beat him. You can make it to the goal, right? Mm-hmm. So another guy who's spoken against China, because I think this whole thing is going towards China. I think the West is going to subdue China and Russia. And China's getting more tied in with Russia. And Barry Weiss interviewed Niall Ferguson on March the 2nd, I think it was. Niall Ferguson said, Putin's invasion was greenlit by Biden, because Biden said, go ahead with the North Sea pipeline, or actions to that effect, and we're not going to supply Ukraine with arms. But he also said China made a number of deals, too, with Russia, that basically, don't worry, we got your back. And Fortune and other magazines, Fortune, Forbes, and The Economist are doing stories on that. They're showing the connection between China and Russia, how China's going to help out the Russians with the economic sanctions, and how the United States is now saying, China, if you do that, that's a no-no, and we're going to sanction you. So now this conflict in the Ukraine is expanding.
Yeah, and I think the premier of China said the sanctions aren't fair, or they're not right.
Yeah, they probably did. I
thought I read that today.
Well, what people lost sight of, because this was written August 13, 2021, was a piece by George Soros. And it was written in the Wall Street Journal. And it's an opinion piece. It says, Xi Jinping's dictatorship in China threatens the Chinese state. In his quest for personal power, he's rejected Deng Xiaoping's economic reform path and turned the Communist Party into an assemblage of yes-men. This is George Soros writing this, while Afghanistan and Kabul was falling. A lot of people missed this. They didn't care about it. He said, Soros says the U.S. stands for a democratic open society. That's the Open Society Foundation, which, was responsible for a lot of changes in American society, to include getting prosecutors elected of a certain ideological type that I think are harmful to the people. The U.S. stands for a democratic open society in which the role of the government is to protect the freedom of the individual. And then later on, he goes on and says, Mr. Xi is engaged in a systematic campaign to remove or neutralize people who have amassed a fortune. Oh, that's a no-no. So his latest victim is Sun Da-Wu, and prior to that, there was Didi Zhu, and of course, Jack Ma, who were all silenced. Mr. Sun has been sentenced to 18 years in prison. So what you see is Xi and the Chinese Communist Party cracking down, on the wealthy, on the powerful, on the plutocrats, on the billionaires in China. They're cracking down on them. And that is something that the socioeconomic elites of America and of the West don't like. They don't want that. That's what liberalism, I submit, was ultimately about, was to check the power of the state so these guys can make money and have real power in society, because the wealthy really do have power in this society, and they really always have. And that's been documented a lot of times. But here's the punchline, and then please take it away.
Yeah.
He says, this is George Soros, I consider Mr. Xi the most dangerous enemy of open societies in the world. I consider Mr. Xi the most dangerous enemy of open societies in the world. So what that means to me is that there's clearly a Chinese aspect to this thing in the Ukraine. And this thing is going to spin towards China. And it's going to escalate tensions with China. And I think the goal of, you can call them the globalists or the global plutocracy, is ultimately to change regimes in China, in Russia, and to subdue those for their purposes.
Okay, so the governments exist to govern and to reduce evil, okay?
And build virtue, that's
yeah,
what it's
and the love of money is the root of all evil. It says in the King James Bible, or another translation may say the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, okay? But it's aiming in the same thing. So if you're a government and you realize the love of money is a huge problem, well, what are you going to do if you're going to govern correctly and make virtue dominate? You're going to control it. Is it unreasonable to think you should control that?
No, I think that's what the leaders all throughout history have done, and that's what the value of state-instituted church, the Catholic Church did. It checked those appetites. Now, people will argue, and I think there's some basis to this. They'll say this will slow down, economic innovation, economic growth. And let me refine my comment. I think it may slow down some technological advances till they are properly vetted to see how it's going to affect society, so you don't have these disruptive changes in society. But at the same time, the Catholic religion is there to bring justice to everybody. So if you have, strong rulers who base their policies on this religion, then they are supposed to have good societies. That's the Catholic religion. That's the Catholic idea.
But the ideal of the Catholic religion is finding the most virtuous person, and that's why you had a monastery system, and they were proven, and you kind of could trust who was actually honest. Okay. But now we live in a culture, we don't know who's honest as far as their virtuous life and their ability to be have integrity in their objectivity in discerning things. The churches are weak. I'm not just picking on the Catholic Church. The churches are weak in America.
I don't disagree with you, and that's you have the First Amendment that stops the institution of a state church and cuts. And with all the cases that came after Everson, you have the churches driven out of the public sphere, so they don't have a lot of power. So you don't really have a check on people's appetites in many ways. It becomes an issue of factions, which is what the founders talked about. We have factions. Well, if a faction is just simply about property and maximizing wealth, I think you're going to have a very contentious society, which I think for a while was not so noticeable. But after a point, by the end of the 1800s, for sure, you saw vast accumulations of wealth. I mean, you had the Civil War that was fought.
Then you had the Gilded Age, and it became really about money.
It really became about money and became more concentrated. That was dialed back in the 1930s, but now since the 1980s, it's becoming more and more concentrated wealth, and there's no check on this appetite.
Now, don't they say democracy leads to dictatorship, right? They say that. Democracy leads to dictatorship. I think Churchill said that.
I don't know if he said it. Somebody said it.
Well, democracy, another name for democracy is the experiment in self-government, let's say. Then that's what they call the experiment many times. It's an experiment in self-government. So democracy, they asked John Cotton, we probably said this many times, Cotton Mather was named after John Cotton, one of the first Puritans. And they were discussing democracy, and Cotton wasn't familiar with the concept of democracy, and he goes, democracy is when the people rule. Then he goes, and then, well, who rules the people? Well, in a sense, nobody, because they can govern themselves. We believe that people are able to govern themselves, and you don't need government. Okay, so they can govern their appetite for food. How's America doing? They can govern their appetite for sex. How is America doing? They can govern their appetite for money. How are they doing? Obviously, we are failures to the nth degree.
I think you're also saying the churches are failing.
They're conquered by gluttony and fornication and love of money.
And I think what my book, John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, American Proposition, talks about is it talks about how the Catholic Church was changed by accepting liberalism. And I think what happened to the Catholic Church, you had Americanism take over, which says Americans know best. The American system of social organization is the best. which means it's basically up to the most powerful people in society to determine things and then cloak it with saying this is what the people want. I think that is how this is starting to play out. And we're seeing that in our life. And we're seeing this thing go in from liberalism, the American experiment, from liberalism to totalitarianism.
So what's going to happen is, it's just like, let's say there's a father that for some reason was estranged, and he comes back to his home, and he's got 6 kids, and they're all super obese, and they're all fornicating up a storm, and they have jobs that are just completely selling drugs or whatever. Well, he's going to have to come in and be a dictator, and he's going to say, here's when you're allowed, here's what you're going to eat, and when you're going to eat it. And you're not allowed to be with the opposite sex, that's it. You're not allowed. And these are the jobs that here's how you're going to make your money. And that's in a family. I'm talking about the nation. The dictator's going to have to come in and be like a strong father in the home. And he's going to say, nah, you guys are heading straight to hell. There's only one way to save you. We got to stop. You can't govern yourself. I'm going to have to step in and govern. It's like these schools that are failing. The state comes in and takes them over. Or the feds come in and take it over. Or I guess the UN will come in and take them over.
Well, every ruler has got to rule in accordance with God's law, or else he becomes a tyrant. And
now.
That's right. If you don't rule in accordance with God's law, you're considered a tyrant. Under Catholic
that is
doctrine.
not the definition of most tyrants.
Well,
most people for the word tyrant.
That's Catholic doctrine. If you don't follow God's law, then you don't have laws.
Okay, so here's President.
And you're using the system then for your own good.
So here's President Obama. He was against same-sex marriage, but then he saw the light, and he promoted same-sex marriage. Now, is same-sex marriage in conformity to God's law?
If you don't follow God's, well, no. I mean, your answer is no.
So wouldn't that be tyranny then? Aren't we being imposed with? Isn't tyranny on us when they promote same-sex marriage? And isn't that how the Russians feel? We don't want these tyrants imposing this tyranny of same-sex marriage type stuff.
And who benefits from that? A lot of people are hurt, but who benefits?
Probably the rich people.
Yeah, probably the plutocrats benefit because they break up the society. So then what I have argued is that what you have is a system where you have basically, in liberalism, you had a system where the control of government was really left to really the powerful and the rich people. And I think Kevin Phillips just simply documented that. And I think he would agree, and I would agree with him. So we would have that same thing. You know, what we're seeing is the same story in a way. We talked about narrative before. We're seeing the same story today with the Ukraine that we saw 30 years ago with Saddam Hussein, that we saw with Adolf Hitler. Okay, this bad dictator comes in, we're fighting for freedom. And what has got a lot of people skeptical and quiet is they remember that there were lies told about Saddam Hussein, you know, about babies being taken out of incubators. And they remember, too, when the U.S. went into Iraq, that there were lies told about where the weapons of mass destruction. You know, so a lot of people, I think, are quiet on this, and they're skeptical of what they're hearing. They're not going to come out and say the MSM is wrong or right. They're just kind of listening. And we've already seen some of the MSM stories debunked by reputable people.
Well, with Vigano coming out with that, if you're Catholic, that is no lightweight.
That's not lightweight. When an archbishop, a former papal nuncio, that's really no lightweight. So you have a lot of people who are skeptical. You hear the same mantra. You've seen this movie before. And the way it always ends up is the tyrant gets beaten and he gets pushed out, and then that area comes under the control of a new leadership which is friendly to the West and to liberalism. The value of Russia being taken is that it can flank China. So I think that somewhere in the planning processes, somewhere, you know, they're thinking of this long term, and it's something that it hasn't been addressed yet in the media, but they're building the case definitely against China with all of this. So, you know, if Putin is thrown out and China is subdued, which we don't know. I mean, the sanctions that are there may hurt the people in the society, but those societies have held on a long time. Look at Cuba, look at Venezuela. They held on for a lot of years. In Iran, the people suffer, but it's questionable whether the sanctions will really be effective.
But if they take over Russia, the Patriarch's concern about sodomy, they're going to bring that into the country. If they take over, they're going to bring that liberalism in.
Well, they're going to bring in, undoubtedly, the whole, if they change regimes, what was there before will be gone. You know?
Right, but a liberal society will be there.
A liberal society through and through will be in that society. I want to leave you with something. I guess we're getting to the end here, but this is from the Catholic Catechism. I think it really speaks, to the international relations here. Section 2316, quote: "The short-term pursuit of private or collective interests cannot legitimate undertakings that promote violence and conflict among nations and compromise the international juridical order." So, I think that's something which bears directly on what is going on in the world today, especially given this move forward of the globalists or the plutocratic elites.
What nations, are being affected by it? Bogano's accusing us primarily as the main one behind this. He calls it the deep state that really took over with Biden. He's saying that's at the core of where this is coming from.
He says it's come from the deep state. Who's affected? The sanctions are affecting right now Putin, his inner circle. A lot of the banks are being cut out of the SWIFT system. You're getting objections from Jamie Dimon, and God, I just saw his name, but I forget it. He's a big economist with Swiss Bank now. He says you're actually starting to see a change now, perhaps, in the global economic regime. So you're starting to see the dollar may no longer have ascendancy. Michael Hudson said this too. You're destroying the system you set up. So these sanctions that are in place, and we don't have the end of this story yet. While I think China is part of this story, we don't have the full end of the story, how this is affecting the economic structure in society. This is going to be very interesting at global society. It'll be very interesting to watch, because these sanctions, what sanctions do basically is they freeze assets, they seize assets sometimes, they give information to law enforcement, they don't allow transactions with those people who are on the sanctions list. With the case of the SWIFT banking system, you can't use that messaging system, but like Jamie Dimon said, he said they can use other messaging systems. So that's just going to hurt us. We're not going to be able to see their transactions, but they'll still be able to do these transactions. And now today, Biden cut off the oil from Russia, which is sending gas pretty high, and people are calling for the pipeline to be reinstituted again that Biden canceled. So this is having a wide-ranging economic impact. It's really dividing the world economically. Where this goes, we don't fully know right now. But I think based on the national security strategy, we can safely assume Russia and China are both targets of the West for regime change, especially with George Soros.
So it's going to be a matter of can Russia hold against this global onslaught? And the global onslaught is an effeminized liberal culture. And the Russians, with the Patriarch, is more toward patriarchy. And that's why they don't like Putin to begin with, because he represents a patriarchy.
Oh, he's a strong, autocratic, patriarchal leader.
It's what he represents in their Jungian archetype or whatever. I'm just saying, this is so bizarre. It's an emotional thing.
A lot of people said that too about who's the talk show host, Rogan. About Rogan, they said he was just too masculine for his own good, and so that's why they came after him. And there is that attack in our society against masculinity and against authoritarianism. And that's really a fundamental attack. And you've talked a lot about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, just as a side note, when you say the word authoritarianism, people throw that word around like there's an actual definition for that. Yeah. He's an authoritarian. Does anybody have any idea what's supposed to be meant by that?
Well, I think what a lot of people mean by that is you're unpleasant.
Well, how about if I find another person that thinks I am pleasant?
Well, then you're not authoritarian to that person.
We have 10 minutes left, so we got plenty of time.
We have 10 minutes?
Oh, yeah, don't worry.
Oh, my gosh, I lost track of the time. I thought we were almost out of time. I don't know if I have more to talk about. But
well, let's just, we're talking about tyranny and authoritarianism. Those two words kind of, in a lot of people's minds, go together. Maybe authoritarianism is the stage right before tyranny, okay? But these are terms people use, okay, all the time, as if there's a definition for it.
Well, it's about power. It's power relationships.
There's an emotional definition.
Well, and it's power relationships, yeah. It's both of those things, yeah. The emotions follow in on whether somebody who's not supposed to have power is perceived to have power. What I'm saying, and what I want to be known here in this discussion today is that there is a real dynamic, and there has always been a dynamic, against powerful leaders, power in the government. George Soros is part of the globalists. Everybody accepts that and knows that. Everybody knows that he's with this global plutocracy, and they're trying to advance, change cultures around the world. At Davos, he said in January 2020, I'm donating money to destroy ethnicities around the world. Okay, so this guy wants to destroy all authority, all power outside of what is made in the corporate boardrooms. He wants these people in the corporate boardrooms, the entrepreneur, the hedge fund managers, to have the ultimate power or say in society.
The ones who have been successful in the game of money.
In the game of money. But you know what? That's exactly right. But they don't know what's right or best. You may have millions of dollars, but that doesn't mean you're wise. It just simply means that, or wise enough to govern. It just simply means that you're probably good at some business transactions and lucky.
And if the love of money is the root of all evil, there's a good chance you're the least virtuous. Because the early church thought the rich were pretty much evil because generally it was understood, how did they get their money?
Well,
it wasn't by being virtuous necessarily.
That's what St. Paul says. The love of money is the root of all evil, right?
Yeah, and you have to love it. You have to first love it, and then you go after it. Now, if you're content with just food and clothing, because that's all you need, then you're content with it.
And what Christ said, in the Gospels, he said, you can't serve two masters. You serve either wealth, mammon, or you serve God. That's what he said, and that's a meme, if you will, which has persisted through the years. You serve either wealth, or you serve God.
Right, but like you said, the fellow who wrote the book from Indiana, Beard, and Gordon S. Wood, is that this American experiment started out with high ideals. The British aristocracy, we were going to replace it with a even better aristocracy, or better men. Okay, they were corrupt and we weren't. Well, they found out very quickly we were corrupt too. So all of a sudden they had to shift plans and go commercial. They had to consciously make this a commercial experiment. And so business of America is business, as Coolidge said. So how do you?
Well, I think the British. We've spoken about Thomas Parnell before. He was one of the colonial governors. I think it was Massachusetts, 1757, 1760. He wrote a memorial. They had these incredibly long titles back then. I mean, that filled half a page. Memorial about the American colonies. And he said, basically, the spirit of commerce is what is fueling the difficulties between the colonies and England. Mm-hmm. He said, that's it. And then he wrote, and that was in 1764.
Or it could have been, it was our greed that pushed us to revolt. Another way of saying it.
Well, I think the founders were the elites, as separate from the elites appointed by the king. And they saw enormous economic opportunity, and you had the 1763 decree from the king saying you can't go any further west than some line in the mountains.
Yeah, to protect the Indians, partly.
Well, partly Indians, partly to keep peace because the crown couldn't fight it. But I think the colonists understood they were losing money. But in 1780, or at least the colonial leaders did, in 1780, Parnell wrote another piece, and he said, the whole world's changed now. That American independence is a foregone deal in 1780. He said it's going to happen. And so the whole world, Europe, will revolve around the United States. And if you look at some of the writings of some of the founders, some of their friends said, this is great. The American Revolution is a great thing because now America can destroy that old world. Okay? And so that's in
the old world, a lot of that to do with Thomas Paine, whose mission was to destroy Christianity.
And we all know about Thomas Paine, what he did. I mean,
so destroying the old world for Thomas Paine was destroying Christianity. And when those guys say it, they're probably buying into some of Thomas Paine.
I think they were buying into some of it. And I think that at the heart of Europe was the idea of the Catholic Church. So that's kind of what they went against. Now, fast forward about 170 years, and you get this guy, Carl Schmidt. Now, there's this new interest in Carl Schmidt. Carl Schmidt was a German. He was a Catholic. He was a lawyer and a judge. He was a Nazi. The Nazis kicked him out of the Nazi party. He refused denazification, and he wrote a book, Nomos of the Earth. And in that book, he said, America's the center of the earth. It has reshaped everything. So the heart of the West is now America. And so that's you know.
That's what Pagano said. It was the deep state of America. It is the deep state driving this whole thing over there.
And I think that what you have is you have a growing global plutocracy, people from all different societies and cultures, and they're reaching out to everybody in every society, probably even the Russian oligarchs, to say, hey, join us if you just, get rid of Putin. I think that's the meta talk in some of these articles.
And Trump was slowing down their progress, at least.
He was still going after China. I mean, you have Steve Bannon is financed by a big Chinese billionaire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who is opposed to the communist
I'm just
regime
saying
like
he was
Soros.
slowing it down.
Well, he wasn't going towards Russia as hard. Okay. And then, but still, Russia. He put Russia, on the list, as a revisionist power. That's the enemy of America. You can't have revisionist powers. So that's who Steve Bannon. That's the Epoch Times too. The Epoch Times is funded by was started by the Falun Gong.
Yeah, I know
which is anti-Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah,
and they
were huge at January 6th.
And they tap into Catholics and they tap into hardworking American nationalists, just like Steve Bannon does. And they're recruiting these people, not recruiting, but they're getting their support eventually to help in the struggle against China, and the rhetoric is ratcheting up.
Right. So it's good. Yeah. So you're going a little bit further than Pagano, and you're saying that what this is really about is kind of neutralizing Russia, so we can move in position, and then we'll have China encircled, and then we can keep China contained because there's a fear. Like they always had a fear Hitler was going to take over the world, which I don't believe, and then China's going to take over the world. Right? Isn't there a fear?
I think that's going to be a lot more the rhetoric as time goes on.
Yeah, yeah. And then the truth is, was it Hitler trying to take over the world, or was it America trying to take over the world? And is it China trying to take over the world?
Well, in my book, I talk about 1941. I talk about the American century began in 1941 as they were getting ready to go into World War I. It was for World War II, as they were getting ready to go for economic reasons. That was clearly stated by Henry Luce. Why we have to go to war against Germany and Japan? For economic reasons.
Well, okay. Well, the love of money is the root of all evil. We have to keep that in check. This is Peter Helen, David Wemhoff on Citizens for Community Media.